Hey there guys, we're taking a look at Batman Arkham Origins running on the AMD Ryzen 5 5500U. Now the game is currently running at 1080p with the lowest in-game graphics settings, and we're at the stock 15-watt TDP. Now the level of performance that we're getting here, at least in terms of averages, looks pretty impressive, but the 1% lows do leave a little bit to be desired there. You'll see that there is a constant and noticeable stutter sometimes throughout the gameplay that can detract from the overall experience, but if you look at those frame times, in general they are relatively smooth. So it's not like this is a completely awful experience, but it is one that I think most people might find annoying, specifically just because of the fact that there is a somewhat of a stutter here and there. But even with that being the case, it's still a pretty impressive level of performance that we're getting out of the game at the stock 15-watt TDP at the full 1080p resolution. Really, the 15-watt TDP always ends up letting us down in terms of the 1% lows. The averages a lot of the times at the stock 15-watt TDP can be pretty impressive, but it's the 1% lows that can drag down the overall experience. They're not to the point where it is super awful, but especially as you're navigating across the city, you will notice that things will stutter as things are being loaded in. And for a game like this, depending on how focused you are on wanting to get as high of a combo as possible, like if that is what the game is to you, you want to get like the best kind of combo scores and all that, you're better off dropping the resolution or raising the TDP to try to improve the 1% lows here, because those stutters might actually be what ends up causing you to take some damage and end your combo streak. So overall, it can be detrimental to the gameplay. It just kind of depends on how much you care about that. Now, raising the TDP up to 25 watts actually improves the performance greatly here, in the sense that overall the experience does become a lot better. You will still notice that there is that stutter here and there when we're just traveling across the map, and it can be a bit distracting there, but it is in non-essential areas essentially, so it's not going to be the absolute worst experience possible. It is going to be perfectly doable in terms of gameplay, especially once you actually get into combat. With an over 10 FPS uplift in our 1% lows, overall the experience is just going to be noticeably smoother, though again there will still be those moments of stutter. It is overall going to be a far more enjoyable experience than just the stock setting, so it's one thing that I would probably consider if you have the TDP headroom, because our averages are also now above 60. So overall this is a really rock solid experience. The biggest issue just being that there is an occasional stutter here and there as you traverse across the map, but it's nothing that is going to be overall detrimental to the experience, and it's going to still let you enjoy the game perfectly fine. So really this actually is a already really playable experience, and realistically I would probably just play the game like this. But we are going to continue to look at it with the 30-watt TDP, and then we're going to go to 900p just to see if we can boost those 1% lows. And at the 30-watt TDP, the level of performance that we're getting here is now pretty incredible because of the fact that our 1% lows are just well above 60 now. This is a rock solid, super smooth experience that really I don't see any reason to adjust anything past this. The only reason that we're going to be looking at 900p is because I know there are a lot of systems out there with this chip that cannot do the full 30-watt TDP. It just becomes far too much power being pumped through, and a lot of the times these systems will have very cheap cooling systems, so they get overwhelmed very quickly at these higher TDPs. So while this is a really nice and pretty much really incredible experience happening here, it can actually end up being a bit of a problem, because if your system starts to overheat, well, you're not going to get good performance. And even if it's not to the point of thermal throttling, you still might run into the issue that the increased heat might actually damage components in your system, especially because cheaper systems tend to cheap out on components, and when that happens, a lot of the times they just are less resistant to increases in heat. So if we look at 900p at the stock 15-watt TDP, the level of performance that we're getting here is more than passable enough. It's not a 60 FPS gaming experience, and you are going to see some noticeable dips here and there, especially as we traverse across the map at a rapid speed. But once we get into the combat, for the most part it's decent enough, but there is still a noticeable stutter here and there, but it's nothing major, and overall the experience is going to be very enjoyable. And really at no point while playing this did I feel like the game was unplayable. It's just varying degrees of playability, where some things were pretty much kind of on the edge just because the stuttering could get annoying sometimes, while other times, you know, like the 30-watt TDP setting was really impressive and really nice to play. This sits a little closer towards the bottom in terms of the overall experience, but it's still more than doable. So if you're stuck on the stock TDP, this is the way to go. There's no reason to drop down to 720p because that's a huge drop in resolution, and overall the experience like this is already going to be more than decent enough to let you play the game perfectly fine. Now at the 25-watt TDP, which is the balanced preset in the AMD APU tuning utility, which is linked down below, guys, it is very easy to use. You really don't need to put a lot of effort into it. It's really easy to raise the TDP on these systems. You pretty much just open up the program, of course run it as administrator, and then just click on one of the presets, whether it's the battery saver, which don't use battery saver if you're using this chip specifically. It's going to just kill your performance. But you can use the balance preset and the performance preset, and the balance preset sets a target TDP of around 25 watts. You'll see that there is a lot of fluctuation in terms of the TDP here. It's mostly just down to the fact that, again, the game doesn't need a lot of CPU. A lot of these older titles don't need a lot of CPU. So what ends up happening is that extra wattage isn't really needed because the GPU will most of the time be at its max speed anyway. And if it's dropping down a lot of the times, it's just because it doesn't need that boost in performance. And here you'll see that the 25-watt TDP really just gives us a rock solid experience where we're more than comfortably above 60 FPS for our average, and our 1% lows being in the mid 40s means that overall the experience is going to be rock solid. And if you don't have an FPS counter on the screen, I guarantee you you're not really going to have almost anything to complain about here. It really is a very, very nice experience, and if you want to just get a little bit of an improvement over 1080p and how it was running with the 25-watt TDP, you can always go with this resolution, but really I would probably just keep playing the game at 1080p. This is really nice levels of performance for sure, but I just feel like the full resolution is probably going to be perfectly fine, and I really, while playing the game, did not feel like there was any issues with 1080p at the 25-watt TDP for the most part. It was perfectly enjoyable. It was nice having that full 1080p resolution and actually be able to play the game very decently. So while this is a very nice experience, I just would not actually play the game like this, but you're more than welcome to do that if you want to. And lastly, we're just taking a look at the 30-watt TDP running on the 900p resolution, and what ends up happening here is that we are getting still some very rock solid performance numbers, though our 1% lows aren't as good as where we were at before. I think it mostly just has to do with the fact that as you traverse around, the stutter is still going to be there. I think that that's just going to be a limitation of this APU in general, that as you move around the map there will be stutter. So it really just depends on how much movement you're going to be doing. If you look at our averages and those frame time charts in general, everything is rock solid, so those moments of 1% low drop really aren't that frequent, at least in terms of the combat. Once you actually start zipping around the map and gliding around, that's when you'll see the drops, and you'll see that as the gameplay rolls out here, that while I was in combat there was no issues, but as soon as I started moving around the map there will be a noticeable stutter here and there, and you'll see the spikes in the frame times. In general, this is present at all of the settings. It's not really something that was going to get fixed by any of this. Maybe if we drop down to 720p, but realistically speaking, I wouldn't really be playing this game at 720p. So it's one of those things where I'm probably just not going to test it at 720p, but in general, I would really just continue to play this game at 1080p with the 25-watt TDP, at least on my system. If your system can't handle the 25-watt TDP, then you can always just drop down to 900p. Even at the stock setting, it will give you a rock solid experience, and you're going to get an overall better 1% low and less stutters in the gameplay specifically compared to 1080p. But outside of that, I really would just mostly just try to stick to 1080p. But of course, it is all personal preference, and of course what resolution the display on your system is. I know there are still some systems that ship with 720p displays, some actually ship with 900p displays, which a system with this chip with a 900p display would actually not be that bad of a move, really, in the sense that if you're someone that doesn't want to have to adjust the resolution manually for every single game, and there are certain games that actually will not even let you adjust the resolution, it will just use your desktop resolution, having it just be straight up 900p from the get-go from the factory does have certain benefits to it, but really that's a topic for another video. Anyways, I hope you found this video useful and interesting. If you did, be sure to subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next one.